Good day, this is Dimitri Lascaris coming to you from Kalamata, Greece for Reason to Resist on March 27th, 2025. During the past 8 years, a former officer in the Israeli military has contacted me repeatedly. In that time, he has worked hard to establish a rapport with me and to use that rapport to acquire information about my pro-Palestine activities. His name is Ahik Aharony. Aharony is no friend of the Palestinian people. On the contrary, he describes himself as an ardent Zionist. At the same time, he is not your typical pro-Israel troll. In fact, I think he can fairly be described as a smooth operator. Our story begins in 2016. At the beginning of that year, I was appointed by Green Party of Canada leader Elizabeth May to be the justice critic in her shadow cabinet. Shortly after accepting that appointment, I traveled to Palestine, and I was so appalled by what I witnessed in the occupied West Bank that I decided to sponsor a Green Party resolution calling on the party to support the BDS movement. When Elizabeth May later learned of my proposed resolution, she became quite alarmed. She warned me that the Green Party's support for BDS would provoke harsh attacks from the Israel lobby, and she urged me to abandon the resolution. But I refused. I felt it was simply a matter of conscience that the Green Party support BDS. When the Israel lobby learned of my proposed resolution, it did indeed attack the Green Party and me personally because of my sponsorship of the BDS resolution. The Green Party sustained such pressure from the Israel lobby that in June 2016, Elizabeth May was summoned to the Israeli embassy in Ottawa, Canada, to be browbeaten by Israel's ambassador to Canada, Raphael Barak. At that meeting, Elizabeth May assured the ambassador of Israel's apartheid regime that the Green Party was immovable on the question of Israel's right to exist. As May would discover, however, her commitment to Israel did not reflect the sentiments of most Green Party members. 2 months later, the Green Party BDS resolution came up for debate and vote on the convention floor in Ottawa, Canada. In that debate, I argued for its adoption. Elizabeth May openly and vigorously opposed the adoption of the resolution, and nonetheless, it was adopted and by a substantial margin. The next day, Elizabeth May publicly threatened to resign from the leadership of the Green Party because she was so distraught about her loss over the BDS resolution. Ultimately, she did not resign, but one thing was clear. I was now on the radar of Israel's embassy in Canada. In early 2017, a friend of mine in the Green Party proposed that we try to build on the momentum established by the victory for the BDS resolution. My friend's name is Dr. David Kattenberg. He's Jewish Canadian, and at that time, he resided in the Canadian city of Winnipeg. David proposed that we bring a lawsuit against the Canadian government. The official position of the Canadian government was at that time and remains to this very day that the West Bank is not part of Israel and is occupied territory. Despite the Canadian government's position on the West Bank, however, the Canadian Food Inspection Agency allowed Israeli settlers who operate vineyards in the West Bank to label their wine sold in Canada as product of Israel. David proposed that we challenge the legality of these wine labels. I agreed to represent him on a pro bono basis in a lawsuit against the Canadian government filed in that year. We launched David's lawsuit in the summer of 2017. It immediately garnered significant attention from the corporate media and undoubtedly from the Israel embassy in Ottawa. Ultimately, the trial court of the Federal Court of Canada agreed with us that the product of Israel labels on these wines were false, misleading, and deceptive, and therefore violated Canadian consumer protection laws. Predictably, the Trudeau government appealed that decision, and as a result of the government's appeal, Canada's Federal Court of Appeal sent the question back to the Canadian Food Inspection Agency for further consideration. In other words, it passed the political hot potato to the regulator. Since then, the Canadian Food Inspection Agency has put the question on ice. 8 years after David launched his lawsuit, he continues to wait for a final determination from the Canadian Food Inspection Agency as to how these wines must be labeled in Canada. In November 2017, before the Federal Court of Canada rendered its decision that these product of Israel labels violated Canadian law, I received a message from Aharony over Facebook Messenger. I had never heard of Aharony at any time prior to that contact. He introduced himself to me by saying that he disagrees with me on, quote, almost everything when it comes to Israel-Palestine issues, close quote, but that he was totally behind, those were the words he used, what Dr. Kattenberg and I were doing. Aharony explained that in his view, it was unfair for West Bank Israeli wine producers to be permitted to use Product of Israel labels. But according to Aharony, the victims of that unfairness were not the Palestinians whose land had been stolen by these settler winemakers. No, he argued, the true victims were Israeli winemakers whose vineyards were situated within the 1948 boundaries of Israel. And why, according to him, was this unfair to Israeli winemakers? Aharony took the position that the West Bank Israeli wineries are in direct competition with wines produced within the 1948 boundaries of Israel, and that West Bank wineries pay less taxes, get huge subsidies from Israel's Ministry of Agriculture, don't pay for the water or for the land they use, and have access to cheap labor. Now stop and think about this. West Bank winemakers are not paying for the water or the land that they have stolen from Palestinians, and they're using Palestinians as cheap labor. But Aharony believed that the victims of this unfairness were Israelis and not the Palestinians. Because Aharony was offended by this unfairness, he offered to find an Israeli winemaker from the West Galilee to support our case. I expressed an interest in his offer, but not because I agreed with Aharony's view about the unfairness of the situation to Israelis. I expressed an interest because I believed that a Canadian court would be more likely to rule in Dr. Kattenberg's favor if his application was supported by an Israeli winemaker. Ultimately, Aharony never connected us with an Israeli winemaker who supported Dr. Kattenberg's case. In fact, his offer of assistance went nowhere. He never raised the subject with me again. Instead, soon after offering to help David Kattenberg, Aharony asked me about a Canadian politician. Her name is Nikki Ashton. Nikki is a member of Canada's Parliament. In 2017, she ran to be the leader of the New Democratic Party, or NDP. The NDP is the third largest party in Canada's Parliament and is widely considered to be the most left-wing of the parties in Canada's Parliament. Throughout her political career, Nikki has been a strong and passionate supporter of the Palestinian cause. Today, she might well be the most outspoken defender of Palestinian human rights in all of Canada's Parliament. Given Nikki's strong support for the Palestinian cause, I have no doubt that the Israeli embassy in Ottawa was quite concerned about the prospect of Nikki's victory in the NDP leadership race. In that race, Nikki ultimately finished third with about 17% of the popular vote. But in the beginning of the contest, before the eventual winner, Jagmeet Singh, entered the race, Nikki was a frontrunner. Shortly after Jagmeet Singh entered the race, a turning point in the contest occurred when a heckler accused Singh of supporting Islamic extremism. The video of their exchange went viral. Singh garnered a lot of support from NDP voters by choosing in that exchange to come out against, quote, all forms of hate, close quote, instead of emphasizing to the heckler that he is Sikh and not Muslim. Throughout the NDP leadership contest, I publicly supported Nikki's candidacy. Among other things, I held a fundraiser for her at my home. In November 2017, a few weeks after the NDP leadership contest concluded, Aharony asked me, quote, how close were you to Nikki Ashton and her campaign, close quote. I responded by telling Aharony what I had already disclosed on social media, namely that I had held a fundraiser for Nikki at my house and had assisted with another fundraiser. I didn't offer him any other information about Nikki's campaign. In response, Aharony expressed the view that the viral video of Jagmeet Singh confronting the Islamophobic heckler was a pivotal moment in the NDP leadership contest. The name of the heckler, by the way, was Jennifer Bush. Aharony then wrote, there's a story behind that. Politics is not always fair and not always what it seems to be. I responded to this message by asking Aharony if he was at liberty to share with me the story behind the viral video. His response was cryptic. He wrote, I feel bad for Nikki. She didn't know what she was getting herself into when she decided to make Palestine-Israel a campaign issue. She assumed that support from pro-Palestinians would boost her campaign. But the Jennifer Bush manipulation that happened as a direct anti-Nikki response boosted Jagmeet's campaign. It's not making me happy when Middle East politics is creeping into Canadian politics. I think that Nikki could have been better for Canadian vote workers than pretty boy Jagmeet. Now, by using the term manipulation, Aharony seemed to be suggesting that the heckler's confrontation with Jagmeet Singh had been staged. If, in fact, the incident was staged, and I don't purport to know the answer to that question, then how would Aharony know that it had been staged? At that point, I decided to do some due diligence on Aharony, so I consulted trusted colleagues from the Palestinian Solidarity Movement. One of those colleagues, a fellow who is very level-headed and quite knowledgeable, informed me that Aharony had been a captain in the Israeli military and cautioned me that I should be careful in my dealings with him. I then dug further by examining Aharony's social media presence. His Facebook profile revealed nothing about his military background. It also disclosed no meaningful information about his personal life or, in particular, his political opinions. The same is also true, by the way, of his Instagram account. On Instagram, Aharony is even less revealing than he is on Facebook. Aharony's most informative social media account was his LinkedIn profile. On LinkedIn, Aharony lists a company called DRW as his current employer. He says he has been working there for more than 7 years and that his position is principal researcher, whatever that means. DRW is named after Don Wilson, an options trader from Chicago. It describes itself as, quote, a diversified trading firm innovating across both traditional and cutting-edge markets, close quote. If that doesn't sound to you like financial industry gobbledygook, I don't know what does. Now, Aharony's LinkedIn account states that DRW is based in Chicago, but it also states that Aharony is based in Ottawa, Canada. So I checked whether DRW has offices in Ottawa. Its website discloses one Canadian office, but that office is in Montreal, not Ottawa. Moreover, one of the 13 offices identified on DRW's website is in Tel Aviv. Now, why would DRW open an office in Tel Aviv, which is a pipsqueak in global financial markets? In the experiences section of his LinkedIn profile, Aharony also discloses that he worked at the, quote, Ministry of Defense, close quote, as a communications engineer from 1996 to 2000. Interestingly, however, his LinkedIn profile does not state for what country's Ministry of Defense he worked. It doesn't state Israel's Ministry of Defense. It just says Ministry of Defense without referring to any particular state. In addition, Aharony does not disclose on LinkedIn that prior to 1996, he served in Israel's military in a combat capacity. I will come back to that issue later. In February 2018, the NDP held its first policy convention under new NDP leader Jagmeet Singh. The convention was held in Ottawa, where Aharony lives. In advance of that convention, NDP members who were strong supporters of the Palestinian cause decided to bring forward a resolution that clearly pinned responsibility for Palestinian suffering on the state of Israel. Although their Palestine resolution had widespread support among the NDP's members, there were many other resolutions that were up for consideration at that convention. To enable party members to vote on the Palestine resolution, it would be necessary to ensure that the Palestine resolution was accorded a high priority in the voting process. So at the beginning of the convention, before debate and voting on proposed resolutions took place, there was an organizational meeting held early in the morning to determine the priorities of the many proposed resolutions. At that organizational meeting, new party leader Jagmeet Singh packed the room with his own supporters to ensure, in a narrow vote, that the Palestine resolution was accorded a low priority. At that organizational meeting, Singh succeeded in ensuring that the Palestine resolution did not come up for debate and vote at that convention. Instead, NDP members were invited to vote on a cowardly resolution supported by Jagmeet Singh himself. That resolution called on the NDP to condemn violations on both sides of the conflict. When I learned about the plan to put forward a strong resolution in support of the Palestinian cause at the NDP's 2018 policy convention, I decided to attend the convention and to lend my support to that resolution. I was present when the resolution was deprioritized by Jagmeet Singh's supporters, and I was also there on the final day of the convention. And in fact, I joined in a protest on the convention floor against the adoption of Singh's cop-out resolution. During the NDP convention in 2018, at no time did I tell Aharony that I was in Ottawa. In fact, during the entire 8 years that Aharony has communicated with me, I never once initiated contact with him. It was always Aharony who initiated contact with me and did so on dozens of occasions. While I was in Ottawa for the NDP convention, Aharony messaged me to ask me if I could join him for a beer while I was in town. It then became fairly clear to me that Aharony was monitoring my activities carefully. Ultimately, I did not meet Aharony in Ottawa. He nevertheless messaged me and offered his congratulations over what had happened at the NDP convention. He wrote, "Anyway, I wanted to congratulate you. It seems that CIJA and the NDP leadership threw in everything they had into that challenge, and yet we barely escaped a defeat by your grassroots movement. With 200 to 189, I doubt that we will be able to stem the flood for much longer." CIJA stands, by the way, for the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs. It is without doubt the most influential pro-Israel lobby group in Canada. Ultimately, and interestingly, Aharony's prediction proved to be correct. In 2021, under immense pressure from the grassroots of the NDP leader Jagmeet Singh was obliged to accede to a resolution that called for an arms embargo on Israel and a boycott of Israeli goods. Now, after the NDP's 2018 policy convention, the next time I heard from Aharony was in the spring of 2018, a couple of months later. By that point in time, the Great March of Return had begun in Gaza. During the Great March of Return, unarmed Palestinian refugees approached the fence that Israel had constructed to prevent them from returning to their homeland. Under international law, Palestinian refugees have a right to return to their homeland. Israel's military responded to this peaceful protest by gunning down unarmed civilians, disabled persons, medics, journalists, women, and children. On April 25, 2018, at which time I was a correspondent for the Real News Network, I interviewed two field researchers from the Palestinian human rights organization Al-Haq. One of them was Tarek Zakut. In the interview, I asked Tarek about the ammunition that Israeli snipers were using to gun down peaceful Palestinian protesters. 2 days later, on April 28th, Aharony messaged me and commented on my interview of the Al-Haq researchers. He wrote, "You asked Tarek Zakut a question he couldn't answer. What type of ammunition the IDF is using? At ranges of more than 300 meters, the IDF is using NATO M-872 or the very similar IMI 7.62 x 51 LRM. The IMI rounds were considered better but harder to come by. I'm very saddened by this Friday's shootings. When I was an infantry platoon commander, shooting unarmed civilians was completely unacceptable, and it wasn't that long ago." Now, apparently, Aharony had never heard of the Nakba, in which Israeli forces massacred, long before Aharony served in the Israeli military, thousands of unarmed Palestinian civilians. In fact, shooting unarmed Palestinian civilians is written into the DNA of the military in which Ahik Aharony served. Aharony messaged me again in the summer of 2018 when I was a passenger on the Freedom Flotilla to Gaza. I boarded that vessel, the Alauda, in Portugal. Unfortunately, however, I had to leave the flotilla between Spain and Italy because while traveling on the boat, I developed acute appendicitis. Our vessel was obliged to take an emergency detour to Algeria, where I underwent an appendectomy. 2 weeks later, while I was recovering from my surgery, the Alauda was boarded by Israeli forces in international waters near Gaza. Israeli forces brutalized and kidnapped the crew and passengers and took them against their will into the apartheid state. It later deported them. In late July, Aharony messaged me to report what I already knew, that Israeli forces had boarded Al-Auda and were towing it to an Israeli port. He concluded his message by writing, "Apologies for what my people are doing." The next time I heard from Aharony was in the summer of 2019. At that time, he invited me to join him for a drink in Montreal, where I live. At that point, I had not yet met Aharony, but because I was suspicious of him, I thought long and hard about whether to meet him in person. Ultimately, I agreed to do so. We had a drink together in downtown Montreal in June 2018. Aharony had a friendly demeanor throughout our conversation. I told him then that I knew he had served as an officer in the Israeli military, and I wanted to afford him an opportunity to express regret for his military service, but he expressed none. After that meeting and throughout that summer, Aharony continued to message me about my advocacy for the Palestinian cause. Generally, he sought to defend Israel's actions, although he was not aggressive in advocating for Israel. All these exchanges prompted me to ask Aharony a direct question about Israel's crimes. On July 26, 2019, I wrote to him as follows: "It is interesting to compare your attitude to Israel to my attitude to Canada. I relentlessly criticize this country. I see its flaws, and I am not reluctant to condemn them. My loyalty is to humanity, to the weak, the vulnerable, and the oppressed. My loyalty is to a set of humanitarian values. Where does your loyalty lie?" Aharony responded, "I'm a patriot of Israel, and I'm an ardent Zionist, no doubt. At the same time, I am ashamed in the occupation in the West Bank, the blockade of Gaza, and the situation of Israeli Arabs. My loyalty is to the values of liberal democracy, liberty and egalitarianism of every person. Every decent person is a humanitarian, but we disagree on how to make humanity better." Now, in my opinion, all persons who are in a position to oppose injustice have an obligation to do so, whatever their religion, nationality, or ethnicity. But the heaviest burden to oppose injustice lies upon the citizens of the state that commits the injustice. In my view, no one is more obliged than Israeli Jews to oppose the crimes of Israel. Israel's crimes are committed in their name, for their purported benefit, by the government that they have elected and the military in which many of them have served, using the taxes that they have paid to the Zionist government. Feeling shame about the crimes of your government has no value unless that shame motivates you to act. What matters is not that you privately experience shame, but that you act upon your shame and that you do so to the best of your ability in ways that protect the oppressed population. What has Ahik Aharony done to protect the victims of Israel's monstrosities? In Aharony's public commentary, I have found zero criticism of Israel's crimes. Not one peep. Therefore, the shame that he claims to feel is, in my view, utterly worthless to Israel's victims. Now, from 2019 to 2024, Aharony messaged me on dozens of other occasions. It was clear, again, that he was paying meticulous attention to my public commentary, a fact that I pointed out to him more than once. And when I asked him why he followed my commentary so closely, he did not deny that he was paying careful attention to what I was saying. Rather, he said that he likes to have his core beliefs challenged. After meeting Aharony in Montreal, he repeatedly invited me to meet with him again. In July of last year, for example, he proposed that we meet to have a coffee. In response to that invitation, I asked him a pointed question. "Ahik, it's my understanding that you have served as an officer in the Israeli military. Is that true? And if so, do you continue to have any connection to the Israeli military or security services?" Aharony's response was evasive. He did not say whether he continues to have any connection to the Israeli military or security services, and to this very day, he has never answered that question. In the following month, August of 2024, I traveled to Lebanon to document Israel's crimes in the south of the country. During that trip, I visited the Lebanese village of Aitashab, which lies about 2 kilometers from the Israeli border and within eyesight of an Israeli military base. The village was the site of fierce fighting in the 2006 Lebanon-Israel war. After fighting broke out between Hezbollah and Israel in October 2023, Aitashab was evacuated. By the time that I went there in August of last year, the village had suffered extensive destruction. I was able to access the village only because villagers had returned briefly to Aitashab to attend the funeral of a resistance fighter who came from the village. On the day that I visited Aitashab, Aharony messaged me. He told me that he had been in and around the village in 2006 and that I should stay safe. Aharony also advised me not to wear a helmet the next time I visited the village because, quote, "no one can read the press written on it, and it might make me seem like a legitimate target from afar." He then added, "Helmets offer no protection against bomblets." The last time I heard from Aharony was about 2 weeks ago. On March 13th, Aharony messaged me to say that he was going to pass through Kalamata and that he wanted to meet me for a coffee on Tuesday or Wednesday of that week. After some reflection, I decided to accept this invitation. On Tuesday morning of that week, I messaged Aharony with a time and place to meet in Kalamata. About 4 hours before we were scheduled to meet, he messaged me and wrote, "I had a schedule change. I won't be able to make it this time. I apologize." I haven't heard from Aharony since then, and I must say that I found it quite curious that Aharony was in Kalamata in the month of March. Kalamata is a town of about 70,000 people. It sits on the southern coast of Greece, about 2.5 hours from Athens by car. For most people, it's too cold to swim this time of year in Kalamata, and there are no major archaeological sites in the immediate vicinity of the town. So what might have motivated Aharony to come to Kalamata in the dead of winter? Well, one possibility is that the Greek military has an airbase on the outskirts of Kalamata, and at that airbase, the Israeli drone manufacturer Elbit Systems has a training facility. Does Aharony have some connection to this murderous Israeli drone maker? Another possibility is that Aharony was not in Kalamata at all, and that he had no intention of coming to Kalamata. Perhaps he simply wanted to send me a subtle message that Israeli authorities know where I am, they're watching me, and they can find me anytime, anywhere. Perhaps that's also the reason that Aharony messaged me on the day when I visited the Lebanese village of Aitashab last summer. Then again, maybe there's an entirely innocent explanation for Aharony's supposed visit to Kalamata and for his behavior generally. Maybe I'm reading too much into his curious behavior. Is Ahik Aharony an Israeli spy? Does he work in some capacity for Israel's security services? My own view is that the answer to that question is likely yes, but I imagine that I'll never know for sure, and I don't purport to be certain about it. Now, if Aharony wants to clarify these matters, he can always answer the question that I posed to him last year, namely, does he work for Israel's security services in any capacity? If he chooses to answer my question, I will be sure to share it with my audience on Reason to Resist. Moreover, I'm prepared to interview Aharony on Reason to Resist so they can explain to us all why he refrains from publicly criticizing Israel's genocidal regime despite its monstrous crimes and despite the shame that he claims to feel for those crimes. Finally, you might be wondering why I agreed to meet Aharony in Kalamata. Well, the answer to that question is I wanted him to convey a message from me to the Israeli government. I can assure you that it wasn't a kind message, but in the interest of civility, I'm not going to repeat it here. This is Dimitri Lascaris coming to you from Kalamata, Greece on March 27th, 2025.